Hi, this is Davi Barker from Bitcoin Not Bombs. As you may know, I'm in the process of designing a Renegade psychological experiment on obedience to authority, specifically on police brutality. But before we can design the form of the experiment itself, it's important that we outline some ethical guidelines that will be operating under over the course of the experiment or any experiments that we run in the future. Because we're specifically rejecting the state's ethical guidelines for psychological experimentation, it's important that we devise our own philosophically rigorous ethical guidelines. And with that in mind, I'm interested in consulting with scientists and ethicists and psychologists who have something something meaningful to contribute to the discussion of an authentic non-aggression principle derived ethical guidelines for psychological experiments. But since we're just starting out, I wanted to ask you guys some ethical questions. These are some things that have come out of the discussions that I've had with people, and I want to solicit your feedback. One of the first objections that I get from people is the question of trauma. And what it boils down to is the question of whether or not it's ethical or whether or not it consists of a violation of the non-aggression principle to subject subjects in a scientific experiment to witnessing things which might be traumatic. And this is one of the major objections to the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiment, is that the subjects in those experiments, although they signed waivers or they signed consent forms, they were subjected to traumatic experiences above and beyond what might reasonably be expected. And I think that this is an important thing for us to discuss and an important thing to clarify before we begin designing an experiment, is what might constitute too much trauma, what are the things that we can do to mitigate the level of trauma, because we're talking about authority, and when we're talking about authority, we're talking about brutality, and a lot of people have been traumatized by authority in their lives, so it's likely to stir up some difficult memories, perhaps, or you never know. When you're dealing with a large sample size, there's all kinds of things that can result from witnessing some sort of brutality. The second thing that I'd like to discuss is something that occurred to me recently, and it's not really a question of ethics, it's more a question of best practices, although you might be able to construe it as a question of ethics. But when we're talking about guidelines for psychological experiments from an anarchist perspective or from an agorist or voluntarist perspective, this might be something that we want to make sure and avoid doing. If you read The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo, in addition to commenting on his own experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, he talks about the soldiers in Abu Ghraib and their torture of detainees. And he implies, with some documentation, that leadership in the military may have used his experiment as a way to devise a scenario where they could be confident that soldiers would commit acts of torture without being ordered. And in that sense, his experiment, although its original intention was to get to the bottom of prisoner psychology and guard psychology and find a way to undermine the authoritarianism of those scenarios, he may have inadvertently created an instruction manual for the military to create plausible deniability for instances of torture. And if there's a way that we can, I guess I just want to know, do you think, or do the people following this experiment, do they think that that's worth putting into the ethical guidelines? That anarchist, agorist, voluntarist psychological experiments should attempt to avoid fields of study which could be co-opted by the state and used by the state in an authoritarian way?